I'm trying to speak to the people of Taiwan as a friend of Taiwan, because it's as you look around the world and you ask yourself which parts of the world can possibly suffer a great deal as a result of these changes, it's clear that there are some dangerous flashpoints in the world and some less dangerous, or frankly even relatively peaceful areas of the world. And if you had to do a list of some of the most dangerous areas in the world, by any objective calculation, Taiwan comes very high up on the list. So that's why it's very important for the people of Taiwan to understand clearly what is happening, especially in the field of geopolitics. And it's important to emphasize here that these structural changes are phenomenal. I'll just give you one example, right? For the past 200 years, in one way or another, world history has been dominated by the West. Clearly. In fact, 100 years ago, every corner of the world was all colonized by Western powers. My ancestors come from India. In the year 1924, 100,000 Englishmen could rule over 300 million Indians. Isn't that stunning? Isn't that amazing? That was the world. That was the West. So Western power has continued for a very long time. But we are now clearly reaching the end of the era of Western domination of world history. But I hasten to add that the end of Western domination of world history is not the end of the West. The West will still remain the single strongest civilization, still have an impact on the world, but its ability to dominate the world is disappearing. And I just to give you one concrete example. As you all know, after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which as you all know clearly was illegal under international law, many countries, in fact a majority of countries in the world, condemned the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and in response to the invasion, the West imposed sanctions on Ukraine, thinking, hey, this is the right thing to do, and the international community will of course support the West in imposing sanctions on Ukraine. That would have been a natural thing that the West expected. But instead, 85% of the world's population did not follow the West in imposing sanctions on Russia. 85% of the world did not follow the West. So paradoxically, what the West thought was a move that would end up isolating Russia ended up actually in a move that showed the relative isolation of the West from the rest. And the waking up of what I call the global South, who by the way represent 88% of the world's population. The West only represents 12%. The 88% which were dormant for a long time have woken up. And so the texture, the chemistry of the world is changing as a result. And if you want to understand the scale of these changes, maybe let me compare it to something that you all understand. You all know that climate change is having a dramatic effect on our world, right? We're seeing all kinds of new weather phenomena emerge, droughts, hurricanes, typhoons, remarkable changes in the world. But that's what's happening in the physical sphere. But in the geopolitical sphere, we are also experiencing geopolitical climate change. Structural changes are taking place, and if structural changes are taking place, the most dangerous thing you could do is to go blind, sail blind, and pretend that the world isn't changing. And so for the people of Taiwan, when there's so many geopolitical shifts happening, you have to try and understand what they are and how they will impact you. One of the most dangerous spots in the world is seen to be Taiwan. I think everyone knows that a major geopolitical contest has broken out between US and China, and there's no question that it will accelerate over the next 10 years. And so Taiwan is clearly going to be affected by this, because you're going to be a pawn in this contest. Pawns often get sacrificed, so it's important for pawns to be geopolitically adept and make sure they don't get into the line of fire. But of course, one thing that you need to do is to also understand what are the structural forces driving this contest. And I highlight three of them. One is, of course, what I call the iron law of geopolitics. Whenever the world's number one emerging power, which today is China, is about to overtake the world's number one power, which today is United States, the world's number one power always pushes down the world's number one emerging power. This is like an iron law of geopolitics. I think it's extremely important for Taiwan to be aware at at such a dangerous time like this. You got to be very careful with what you do. I know that there are people in Taiwan who believe that what would be good for Taiwan is independence of some kind. That would be dangerous under any circumstances, but it would be especially dangerous at a moment like this. Because if you walk into a room full of gas and you light a spark, you get a major explosion. So people who are pushing for independence have to understand the dangers. And there's also one paradox here. The goal of pushing for independence is to have greater freedom of action, to be able to do more things that you think you can do if you're independent. Effectively though, if Taiwan pushes for independence, Taiwan is going to become more and more isolated globally. Because right now, one of the great benefits of being a Taiwanese is that you have a passport that is recognized and accepted 150, 160 countries around the world. But just imagine if you push for independence, you force countries to decide, do I want to recognize Taiwan as independent? I guarantee you this, the majority of countries will not recognize Taiwan as an independent country. This is a geopolitical reality. So what you do therefore in pushing for independence is to lock yourself up into a small jail and throw the key away. Now this may be a beautiful island to live in, but your capacity to travel and to engage the world will be diminished, especially now because it's such a dangerous moment in history. I also know that people here who believe that perhaps you could go to the UN and get some support in some way or another. Having been an ambassador to the UN for over 10 years, I can tell you that UN ambassadors are incredibly astute in their understanding of global geopolitics. They know what needs to be done, and they also know, many of them, if you force them to make a choice between China and Taiwan, there is no choice for them. Their ties with China have gone up by leaps and bounds, right? Take trade between China and Southeast Asia. In the year 2000, trade between US, China and ASEAN was only $40 billion in 2000. By 2022, it had become $975 billion, almost $1 trillion. Southeast Asian countries cannot sacrifice $1 trillion in trade. A country like Brazil, that's far away. It took Brazil 20 years ago, 1 year, to export $1 billion to China. Now it takes Brazil 60 hours to export $1 billion to China. And you're asking the Brazilians, choose. So therefore, it's very important, if the people of Taiwan want to preserve the peace that they have had, you must understand what a complex, difficult geopolitical environment is arriving your way. Please be extremely alert. Please be extremely careful, because if you're not, the consequences can be very painful.
What makes our world very confusing today is that we are undergoing many major global transitions in world history at the same time. Okay, right? Just as we're shifting to a new geopolitical contest. In the past was between United States and Soviet Union, now it's between United States and China. That would be the main geopolitical contest. At the same time, we are moving away from what I call, in a sense, 200 years of Western domination of world history to the return of Asia. And I can tell you that psychologically the world is preparing for the return of Asia. And I say this with some confidence because of a personal experience I had. And this explains also why I think India will also be integrated into ASEAN. In January 2022, I published my latest book called The Asian 21st Century. It's a free book, open access book. Anybody can download it for free. But Springer Nature expected 20,000 downloads of this book. They said you get 20,000, good result. But as of last week, there have been 3.24 million downloads in 160 countries. And I tell you that story because because it's an indication that the world is psychologically preparing for the Asian century. And India will play a very big role, by the way, in the Asian century. And so you will also see the traditional resumption of links that India had with Southeast Asia. It will happen organically as a result of of the fact. And if you look at Indonesia today, how much influence is there from India? You go to the main circle, you see a statue of Arjuna, right? And you can see, therefore, the traditional links between Indonesia and India. India will come back to Southeast Asia. That I see for sure happening. Good for Southeast Asia, because for the past 2,000 years, the two civilizations that have influenced Southeast Asia the most, by far, have been the civilizations of China and India. And so for Southeast Asia, any framework that includes China and India is by definition a good framework. So even though this framework of Indo-Pacific was a result of the new geopolitics of the day, the result for ASEAN is a positive one, because we can try to integrate both India and China. But what is interesting, and the reason I mentioned why it is good for Southeast Asia to have both China and India in, because there are now, just in case you didn't know this, there are two competing conceptions of Indo-Pacific, right? One is the ASEAN concept, which is what we are discussing here, and the ASEAN concept is open and inclusive, right? And I'm glad that Arshad Rasid began by reminding us that Indonesia's, foundational principle is unity in diversity. And I can tell you that Indonesia has injected unity in diversity into ASEAN also. So ASEAN welcomes diversity. And one other reason why ASEAN is the world's most successful regional organization is because no other region of planet Earth is as diverse as ASEAN is, right? Out of 670 million members, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, you have Hindus, Taoists, Confucianists, and lots of communists. So, despite all that, amazing, no other regional organization comes close to ASEAN in terms of diversity. But because of the Indonesian concept of unity in diversity, we are bringing together everybody, including China and India. But by contrast, the competing vision of Indo-Pacific, and what is basically, to be honest with you, is one that's promoted by the United States. It calls for a free and open Indo-Pacific, but the goal of the US concept, and I'm not exaggerating, is to exclude China rather than include China. I can tell you that ASEAN is a very strange animal. Actually, to be honest, I compare it to a crab. I know a crab always takes 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, 1 step sideways. You see, the crab is only going around in circles. But, and I compare it to a crab because, ASEAN's got 10 legs or so. But yet, amazingly, decade by decade, ASEAN moves forward. Now, let me give you 2 statistics that will, I think, in some ways shock you. In the year 2000, Japan's economy, right, was 8 times larger than ASEAN. 2000. Now, what is it? 1.5 times larger. And in 10 years, ASEAN's economy will become bigger than Japan's. Look at that. Japan was, in the year 2000, Japan was the second largest economy in the world. By 2030, ASEAN's economy is bigger than Japan. That's an example of a fundamental transformation. I'll give you another statistic. The combined GNP of European Union is 17-18 trillion, right? ASEAN is only 3 trillion. Now, in the years 2010 to 2020, which regional organization added more to global economic growth? Was it European Union or was it ASEAN? Correct answer, ASEAN. So people don't understand that ASEAN's economic growth has been remarkable, but also taking 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. We often agree on some things. I can be honest with you. We don't implement. You'll forget about it. So it's true. ASEAN is a very imperfect organization, but despite, and ASEAN will remain an imperfect organization. So we have challenges. How are we going to deal with Myanmar? It's going to be a big challenge, but patiently we will solve it. We won't solve it overnight, but it'll take some time. But in the meantime, we'll continue opening up. That's why I'm very glad you mentioned that for the vision of 2045, we're going to focus on health, education, and the digital infrastructure. And these are all three very, very important things for ASEAN. And the net result of it, by the way, is that the important thing about ASEAN, I must emphasize to all of you, is that the people of ASEAN are benefiting from ASEAN, right? They're benefiting from the peace that we are enjoying. And for example, when ASEAN decided to open up its skies, I know I mentioned about other regional organizations, right? In many regional organizations, you cannot fly from country to country. Now ASEAN has got almost open skies. It's amazing. People can travel. And one, just as a side story, as you know, the most important people in any region are artists, right? Artists are not very rich. They're very poor. But since now we have lots of budget travel, the artists in Southeast Asia have begun traveling. That also is a benefit of ASEAN. There will be, over the next 10 years, take my word for it, a competition between these two competing visions of Indo-Pacific. ASEAN one, which is actually open and inclusive, and the US one, which is free and open, right? And I can tell you that it is vital for our region that the ASEAN concept of Indo-Pacific wins. And I hope that all of you in this room will support the ASEAN vision, because the ASEAN vision will bring all of us together. In theory, the European Union clearly is a much more advanced organization. It has all developed countries and by definition should be better performing than ASEAN. But if you had asked me, even 10, 15 years ago, which organization will break up first? ASEAN or European Union? And everyone will say, ASEAN will break up. Guess what? The European Union had Brexit. One of its biggest members left. And here I'm going to add another very sensitive point. The biggest test of any regional organization is whether or not it can keep peace. And if you cannot keep peace, and if you have a major war on your doorstep, that's a sign of geopolitical incompetence. ASEAN has kept the peace. ASEAN has demonstrated political competence. So believe me, what ASEAN has done, and that's why I wrote a book called The ASEAN Miracle, is truly a miracle, because no other regional organization can match the accomplishments of ASEAN. We in ASEAN must never take success for granted. Right? ASEAN is still an imperfect organization. ASEAN still has challenges. ASEAN still has problems. So we in ASEAN therefore must not believe that success is guaranteed. We must work very hard to keep ASEAN together. But at the same time, we also have a major opportunity. And here I must say, it is truly fortunate that two of the fastest growing major economies in the region, India and China, are our neighbors. And I have no doubt that over the next 10 years, India and China will continue to do very well and grow very fast. And their growth will be good for ASEAN. And here, to conclude with one statistic, I'm going to say that the future of our region is going to depend on the new CIA. Now, CIA doesn't stand for Central Intelligence Agency. CIA stands for China, India, and ASEAN. And why is this new CIA? Why is this new CIA important? Now, if you add up the 1.4 billion people in India, the 1.4 billion people in China, the close to 700 million people in ASEAN, you get 3.5 billion people. Now, out of this 3.5 billion people, in the year 2000, there were only 150 million. Only 150 million in the year 2000 out of 3.5 billion in the middle class population. But by 2020, that number had exploded 10 times to 1.5 billion. And by 2030, the number could be anywhere from 2.5 to 3 billion. This is the world's largest explosion of middle class population ever seen in human history. That's why there's great opportunities down over here. By the way, I keep emphasizing we take 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. So we fail from time to time. So from time to time, when Thailand and Cambodia were about to fight with each other, over the temple, we couldn't solve it immediately. And then when Cambodia blocked a statement on ASEAN, we couldn't solve it immediately. It's okay. We'll carry on. We just carry on. And the resilience of ASEAN is actually remarkable. And as to why the ASEAN story is not well known, I blame it on the citizens of ASEAN countries. They haven't explained to the rest of the world how remarkable ASEAN is. And I can tell you that the next 10 years of human history will be among the most exciting 10 years in human history, because the largest geopolitical contest ever seen in human history between United States and China will accelerate over the next 10 years. That's why I think it'll be challenging for ASEAN. But at the same time, if ASEAN navigates that turbulence well, it will once again show how remarkable ASEAN is.
China's economic growth may slow down dramatically, and if China's economy, for example, grows at 2 or 3% a year, then it will not be able to overtake the United States, because the United States can also grow at 2 or 3%. So clearly, for China to overtake the United States, it has got to continue growing at 4 to 5 to 6% a year. And the question is whether or not you believe China can grow at 4 to 5%. And I actually believe that China can. Because still China is still educating hundreds of millions of people and raising their education levels, and people with a higher education level with access to capital and other resources are able to be economically more productive, and as they become more productive, their per capita GNP will go up, and if their per capita GNP goes up, the total GNP will also go up. So, it's important, therefore, to ask the simple question, can China's economy grow faster than the United States? And traditionally, a country with a per capita income of only 10,000, like China, should have the ability to grow faster than a country like the United States with a per capita income of over 60,000. Are preparing for the Asian century. They know that the Asian century is coming because the Asian countries are growing faster than any other countries in the world. But the only question is whether or not the Asian century will be a peaceful century. So to help ensure that the Asian century will be a peaceful century, we have launched a very, very small initiative whereby we try to produce essays or podcasts that provide suggestions on how to bring about peace in difficult areas within Asia. And we hope that even though many of our suggestions may not be accepted immediately, in due course, if countries accept it, it will lead to a safer and more peaceful world. For example, the reason why a skirmish happened between Chinese and Indian soldiers at the Sino-Indian border is because they had to go and check what's happening at the border with their own eyes. So we wrote an article saying, instead of using our eyes, why don't we plant sensors along the border, and both sides can see through the sensors what is happening. So technology can solve some problems too. So I believe that China and India have begun planting sensors. We don't know whether it's because we suggested it, but it's a positive development. So we hope that if we come up with such concrete ideas that will help to prevent conflicts, skirmishes, and save lives. And at the end of the day, the most important thing the world needs today is peace. And we should work hard to establish peace in Asia also. The contest between US and China will intensify over the next 10 years. And because this is a result of what I call the iron law of geopolitics, that an established power will not allow a rising power to overtake it. That a war between US and China is likely because if you have a war between two nuclear powers and if they start using nuclear weapons, you don't have a winner and a loser. You have a loser and a loser. So both sides will lose millions of people. So that's why I think a direct war between US and China is unlikely. But nonetheless, it's extremely important for both sides to understand that there is a danger of war, and therefore, as responsible countries, they should make every effort to prevent it from happening, and they should therefore intensify their diplomatic exchanges, because diplomacy was invented not to enable friends to talk to each other, but to enable adversaries to talk to each other. And since the United States sees itself locked in an adversarial contest with China, the United States should therefore step up its diplomatic exchanges with China. I'm not comfortable with the term de-dollarization. It is true that many countries trying to reduce their dependence on the US dollar, and this is an understandable trend among the countries in the world because they have seen that the US government will use the US dollar as a weapon against you if you are seen to violate some fundamental interests and concerns of the United States. And of course, the most extreme example of this took place when the United States, together with its West European friends, froze the assets of the Russian central bank. Now, that is actually, in theory, a violation of the sovereignty of Russia because central bank assets belong to the sovereign country of Russia. But once the United States begins to seize the assets of other countries, it is natural for other countries to say, should I keep all my assets in the US dollar? What happens if the United States seizes my assets? And that's why there is a trend towards countries reducing their dependence on the US dollar. But at the same time, in practical terms, there is no substitute for the US dollar in the global economic system. So still, even today, even though countries are trying to sign trade contracts in other currencies like the renminbi, most of the trade in the world is still carried out in the US dollars. But trade actually is not the big area. But there's a huge amount of financial transactions that take place in the world. And about 90% of financial transactions in the world still take place in the US dollar. So even after the China's economy becomes bigger than the US economy, let's say it happens within 10 years, the dollar will still remain the global reserve currency for a long time to come. And it will be difficult for the renminbi to replace it unless China allows free flow of money in the capital accounts. And that's not going to happen soon. So in view of this, I don't see an immediate replacement for the US dollar. But within 10 to 20 years, if the United States continues to weaponize the US dollar, then it's possible the role and influence of the US dollar will not disappear but will diminish significantly. There is a lot of intellectual dishonesty in America when it comes to discussing the plutocracy because the Americans believe that you should call a spade, right? And if you should call a spade, you should call a plutocracy. But of course, this would go against political interests of the politicians, and therefore no politician in America dares to suggest that America has become a plutocracy because in some ways it is the US Congress that is responsible for the creation of a plutocracy because the US Congress takes money from very wealthy people to shape policies that will benefit the very wealthy people. And so since the US Congress is part of the problem in the creation of plutocracy, they are reluctant to discuss it clearly and openly. And that's going to be a competitive disadvantage for the United States. That if you look at the top 10% of the population in America has seen a dramatic improvement in their standard of living. And I'll give you one statistic. In the year 1978, the average salary of the CEO in America was 30 times the salary of a worker in the year 1978. But by 2021, the average salary of the CEO was 1,500 times bigger than the average salary of the worker. So you can see how the top 10% have improved their lives dramatically in America. But the bottom 50% have not seen any improvement at all. They've seen their income stagnate. A Nobel Prize winner, Angus Deaton, has documented all this in his book called The Depths of Despair. So clearly there's something has gone wrong there in terms of the taking care of the common people in America. By contrast, China has had the world's largest poverty alleviation program, and over 800 million people have been rescued from absolute poverty in China. And this obviously makes the people happy and gives them a sense of hopefulness for the future. I actually think that the United States can also do the same, can also improve the livelihood of its people because the United States is still the world's richest country. and it has the resources to improve the lives of its people, but it needs to develop a new social contract between the very wealthy, and the Belt and Road Initiative will continue to succeed and do well because the world at large is very keen to work with China to improve their infrastructure. So many countries need new roads, new bridges, new train lines, new hospitals, and China is the world's infrastructure superpower. It's building more infrastructure, I think, than the rest of the world combined. So for example, in China today, I think has more miles of high-speed train network than all the countries in the world combined. And so with that expertise that China has, it is capable now of sharing and exporting its expertise to the rest of the world. And I think China will find that most countries in the world will join the BRI. Some will not. I mean, India will not, Australia will not, Japan will not. But still, countries are free to choose whether or not to join or not to join. And I believe more and more countries will want to join the Belt and Road Initiative because they want to get better infrastructure, which will help to improve the lives of their people and improve the economic competitiveness of their countries too. The United States denies that it is carrying out a containment policy against China. But it's interesting that quite serious commentators inside America, like Edward Luce of Financial Times, Farid Zakaria of Washington Post and CNN, Max Boot, another commentator, have all said that the United States is carrying out a containment policy against China. And I think it's important for the United States to assess whether such a containment policy can succeed or not succeed. I believe that unlike in the case of the Soviet Union, where the containment policy succeeded because the Soviet Union hardly did any trade with the rest of the world. But in the case of China, since China trades more with the rest of the world than the United States does, any effort to contain these Chinese trading relationships will fail because the rest of the world is benefiting a lot from its trade with China. And that's why it'd be wiser for the United States, instead of going for a containment policy, should try to work out a policy of having agreed multilateral rules for all great powers when they interact with the rest of the world. And so, for example, in trading relationships, in investment relationships, in financial relationships, let's agree on a common set of rules that we work out at the relevant multilateral bodies like the United Nations, for example, like the World Trade Organization or like IMF. So I think it's important, therefore, for the United States to consider the possibility that a wiser course than a containment policy would be a new, different form of engagement policy, but an engagement policy that takes place within multilateral fora, agreeing on a set of rules that all the countries of the world, including US and China, also agree on. Well, I think Hong Kong has a very important role to play in terms of providing a different autonomous space for American companies to establish themselves in before they begin investing in China. And the reason why it was very wise for Mr. Deng Xiaoping to propose one country, two systems, is that it provided a window into China that other companies could be comfortable with. Now, I know many Anglo-Saxon media writers say that Hong Kong has lost all its autonomy, is now part of China. That's not true. Hong Kong, in many respects, still remains an autonomous entity and still has its own rule of law and still has its own financial center, its own stock exchange, and so on and so forth. So I think actually if American companies want to participate in and benefit from the growth of China, it'd be wiser for them to find ways and means of establishing themselves in Hong Kong and then using Hong Kong as the base from which they can then understand China and do business better in China. The leaders of Taiwan have failed to educate their own population on how dangerous the situation is going to be for Taiwan. Because as the US-China contest accelerates over the next 10 years, and it will accelerate for the reasons I've given in my book, Has China Won? Which, as I say, has been published in China too. And in this game of geopolitical chess, Taiwan is a small pawn that could be easily sacrificed. So it's very important for the Taiwanese people to ensure that they don't do something that will damage them. And clearly, if Taiwan declares independence, this will lead to war because China cannot allow the secession of Taiwan from China. So therefore, it'd be wiser for the Taiwanese leaders to tell the population independence is not an option. And even if they declare independence, almost nobody will recognize it. Taiwan will become even more isolated than it is today. And therefore, the Taiwanese people should realize that they should find better ways of managing their relationship with China. And instead of getting engaged in a hostile relationship, they should find ways and means of talking to China, as you had with the Ku Wang talks in Singapore, and also as you had within the meeting between President Xi Jinping and the then President Ma Ying-jeou in Singapore. So clearly, if you're going to be a pawn in a geopolitical chessboard, you have to be very, very careful. It's very clear, all the projections show by the end of this century, by 2100, India's population will be much bigger than China's population. And so by 2100, it's clear that India's prospects of becoming the largest economy in the world will be much stronger because they'll have the world's largest population at the end of the century. But I want to emphasize that the end of the century is still 80 years away. And over the next 10, 20 years, I predict that China's economy will be number one, the United States economy will be number two, and India's economy will be number three. So it will take some time for India to catch up with both US